Department of English and IQAC MES KVM College, Valanching, under UC Brahmas. Now, I invite Professor Basima P. to deliver the welcome address and introduce the speaker. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Respected Head of the Department, Dr. Najla Tiwai, our keynote speaker, Dr. Merin Simiraj, Assistant Professors Mrudul Judin and other colleagues, and dear participants. I'm here to formally welcome you to the session. I'll keep it short. First of all, I extend a warm welcome to our beloved HOD, our strength and support for this program, Dr. Najla Tiwai. She has kindly agreed to chair this session. I welcome you, ma'am. Next, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome dear Dr. Merin Simiraj, our keynote speaker for the session. Dr. Merin Simiraj is currently working as an assistant professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Madras. She is also faculty coordinator of Memory Studies Research Circle, IITM. She was awarded her PhD from IIT Bombay with an Institute Award for the best thesis and has been on a journey of academic success since then. Her courses offered through NPTEL are especially popular. I gratefully welcome you, ma'am, to the session. Next, I welcome Jidin Kumar, Assistant Professor, Department of English, to the session, as well as my colleagues, my dear faculty of the department. Now, finally, I extend a very warm welcome to the participants, especially teachers and students from the Menti colleges. I welcome you all to the session. I would hand over this to Dr. Najla Tiwai, who is the chair. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Basima. Good afternoon. Welcome to the second plenary session of the two-day national webinar on narratives of freedom struggle in South Asian literature. Discussions on the question of historiography have entered mainstream conversations today, and we see textbooks and other documents being written or new narratives forged. An understanding of historiography prompts us to ask, who writes history and with what ends in mind? It is never an objective relating or reporting of the events, not even if the intent was guileless, because how much can we trust one's own memory? That's a different trajectory altogether. Memory sometimes obscures or elide aspects of history. Memory is formed in a specific social context and is exterior, unlike dreams, which are interior. Maurice Halbwachs proposed the idea of memory as a social phenomenon. He argued that memory is not just a matter of the subjective, but reflective of the social context. It is the group dynamics that dictates what and how an event is remembered. Collective memory experiencing the past is organic and living, as opposed to history, which is dead. The relevance of the past and the present is emphasized with the concept of collective memory that he proposes. In my PhD thesis, actually, I had looked at how Orhan Pamuk in his novel, The Black Book, puts those words exactly into the mouth of a character where he laments the loss of collective memory, which he thinks forms the root of society, which is why he thinks that the authorities are so right in targeting that. History is the remembered past to which we no longer have an organic relation, the past that is no longer an important part of our lives, while collective memory is the active past that forms our identities. This colonial baggage, which bears so much on who we are now as a result of the past. Jeffrey Olek, in his entry on collective memory in the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, writes, groups can even produce memories in individuals of events that they never experienced themselves in any direct sense. So it would be interesting to see the observations of Dr. Merin Simiraj in her presentation, where she interviews so many of these concepts in the context of postcoloniality. On that note, may I invite our keynote speaker for the second plenary session. She will speak on narratives of postcoloniality, historiography, storytelling, and memory. Ma'am, please.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Najila, for your very kind introduction. And I really love the way in which you try to situate historiography and storytelling. And you did invoke Pamuk, who's also one of my favorite writers. And I do think that, you've already set the context for our discussion today in terms of bringing in different aspects of memory, the aspects of remembering into this within the scope of this seminar. And I do think it is, I congratulate the entire team for coming up with such an inclusive theme here. Because it's very interesting that you did not mention what kind of freedom struggle or what kind of South Asian literatures. Yeah, it's in very simple, but as well as in very organic way. It's kept very open-ended. It could be any kind of freedom struggle. It does not mention anything in particular. I think, the call for papers have been, thanks to Basima, I've been closely following this, the entire planning of this webinar. And I do find, there is an organic way in which things have been coming together. And also lovely to see you here, Basima. Basima was one of our finest students here in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Madras. It is wonderful to connect with you at this level and meet you, albeit virtually. So this is indeed a great opportunity for me, and I do thank all of you, the organizers at the professional as well as personal levels. Right. So I've titled my talk as Narratives of Postcoloniality, Historiography, Storytelling, and Memory. Yeah, there are a whole range of terms which have come in together. It's quite loaded, as you can see. I do not have the heart to leave out any of these terms because when you talk about postcoloniality, there is an inherent way in which all of these aspects come in together. Dr. Najila had already shown us in very succinct terms how these terms can very comfortably sit together, but at the same time, they have the potential to ask very uncomfortable questions, about, who remembers and who has been authorized to remember, who writes history. And historiography, I think, is, we've reached a point in academics in this trajectory of history where, we ask these pertinent questions in a number of ways these days about, who writes history and whose memory, whose stories are part of these different narratives. Yeah. So Basima had very kindly mentioned that we are part of, there is a memory studies research network here at IIT Madras. So I will begin with a very brief reference to that. And I'm also happy to inform you all that now our proposal for a Center for Memory Studies has been approved, and we are now working towards establishing a Center for Memory Studies, arguably one of the first in the entire South Asia. There's, as you might be knowing, there are a number of centers for memory studies in different parts of Europe. So what we are also trying to do through this is to bring in a perspective for memory studies, which is not entirely Eurocentric. Yeah, of course, there are a lot of theoretical frameworks on which we all, end up, the Western theoretical frameworks that we end up drawing upon. But based on those foundations, we're also trying to build a perspective which is non-Eurocentric and bringing in the idea of the idea of the importance of remembered histories. Yeah, the importance of looking at memory from our location, being a post-colonial location as well. Yeah, so just to give you a sense of the kind of work that we have been trying to do over here and the kind of research that we've been involved in. Last year as in 2019. Yeah, in 2019 we held the first memory studies conference in India. It was hosted at IIT Madras, and we were looking at particularly one event. Jallianwala Bagh. 2019 was the centenary year of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, as you might be knowing. So we were trying to look at an event from the colonial history, from the British colonial history, an event that is removed from us in different ways in terms of time, space, in terms of historical framework, looking at it through the lens of memory studies. And so one of the things that we tried to do there was to bring in the aspect of art and technology into this lens of memory studies. So we could come up with, in addition to the many academic and historical discourses that we had organized as part of the conference, we could also come up with, through collaborations with TCS, Tata Consultancy Services, and their XR lab, to come up with an AR animated mural artwork. Yeah. So if I'll be happy to share the details if you could write to me later on. So this AR animated mural artwork, what it did was, when viewed through a certain app, it would begin to animate in terms of, there would be sounds, there would be the graphic image, the images would begin to move. Yeah. So it was a kind of a recreation of a historical event in a more immersive and experiential terms. Yeah. So moving away from, it was in some sense a continuation of the post-colonial narratives, and in some sense a departure from the modes through which we have always looked at the experience of post-coloniality, the ways in which we've looked at the different narratives of post-coloniality. Yeah. So that aside, as I said, I'll be really happy to engage with you later on if you have, if you would like to work with us in terms of, if you're looking for internship opportunities, if you are thinking about, knowing more about this new field of memory studies. If you have in mind, we will be coming up with a number of short-term courses. There'll be workshops. Yeah. So I'll be happy to keep you in the loop if you would, if this is something that is of interest to you. So coming back to the crux of our session. Yeah. So here my attempt is to look at this aspect of post-coloniality through the lens of memory studies. And when we say post-coloniality, we do know that, it's a very fraught field, and it's very difficult to even pin down the word to a single definition. Of course, there have been endless debates about whether post-coloniality is a hyphenated term or a non-hyphenated term, and what the post in post-coloniality means. There's this very telling essay by Anthony Appiah, where he wonders whether the post in post-colonialism and postmodernism are the same. So there have been a lot of debates right from the definition, and now we have come to a point where we know that one needs to move beyond the definitions. It's not entirely about what the term means, but also about celebrating these varied definitions, primarily for their difference. Yeah. So now when we are talking about post-coloniality, we're also looking at it from a very postmodern point of view, because we do know that, particularly from our location, when we are talking about the Southeast, the literatures produced from our side of the world, yeah, and if we take Salman Rushdie at some level, as the starting point of this new kind of post-coloniality, we do find that it is a post-coloniality which is mediated by postmodernism as well. So now when we are looking at narratives, when we are looking at post-coloniality, we're also looking at this through different other lenses. Yeah, I will centrally talk about how this experience becomes a very unique experience when we are looking at it through the lens of memory studies, but we are also speak with the overarching understanding that we are also very much aware of the many post-colonial frameworks which have radically challenged and sometimes radically changed the way in which we look at most of these terms. So what exactly is memory studies? I'll give you a very, very fundamental working definition. So memory studies is a very new field, though, there have been various ways in which memory has been used as a tool to engage with culture, to engage with literature. Centrally, it began to be acknowledged as an academic field only in the last few decades. So it emerges from a range of contemporary trends, and it talks about a shift from concern with historical knowledge of events to that of memory. Yeah. So the shift is more about from what we know to how we remember it. Yeah. So we do know that in the postmodern scenario also, this has been this change has been underscored in various ways about from what we know to how we know. But here, when we are looking at memory studies, when we're looking at aspects through the lens of memory studies, we are talking about this shift from what we know to how we remember it. Yeah. I repeat, we already know that there has been huge shifts happening in this sense about, the shift from what we know to how we know it, the modes of knowledge. But here we are talking about not just knowledge, we are also talking about the modes of remembering it. So this is a very significant shift, because we are talking about multiple things in the same level, without, of course, while being attentive to the different locations and the different trajectories and the different traditions and the different hierarchies from where they come from. Because there was a point in history where history, documented history, was given a privileged status compared to non-documented history. And even inferior to that, in this hierarchy, even much lower to that, was the position of memory, because the memory had something, it was very private. It did not have the kind of validation that something like history would have. So we will not get into the details. Towards the end of the session, if we have sufficient time, we will of course talk about the ways in which the historical movement from history towards memory, this shift in trends and understanding from history towards memory has happened in a systematic way. So when we talk about the memory studies as a domain, we are talking about this shift. And this shift could be of different kinds. It could be technological, political, interpersonal, social, cultural. And it all affects all of these different kinds of shifts. Some would be very momentous, some would be very mundane. They all affect what, how, and why we remember. Not just remember, but also forget. That is something that we will come to very soon. So they all affect the content of what is remembered, how we remember, and why we remember. And when we talk about we, it is about individuals as well as societies. And inherent in this understanding, in these definitions, in these approaches to memory studies, is that there is something very, very conscious behind this aspect of remembering, behind this aspect of memory. It is not something which just happens because it is there. There is a politics at work. There is a politics of memory at work. There is a politics of forgetting at work, which you must have spoken about, which you must have encountered in different contexts. So now when I'm trying to link postcoloniality, postcolonial narratives, postcolonialism with memory studies, I would begin with this fundamental understanding that there's a paradoxical relationship between postcolonial studies and memory. So what do I mean when I say this? For the longest time, when one was engaging with postcoloniality, when one was engaging with the narratives of postcoloniality or postcolonial studies in general from any part of the world, because there are different kinds of postcolonialisms depending on the location from where you access it, depending on the lenses through which you view it. So this has been paradoxical because there has always been a privileging of narrative, a privileging of histories and stories over memory. So if you survey the canonical works of postcolonial writings, postcolonial theories, you would notice that very surprisingly, there's very little mention, and sometimes hardly any mention of the category of memory in the theories or practices of the field. Michael Rothberg has a very interesting essay where he looks at this entire absence of the discourse of memory from the discourses of postcoloniality. At least the canonical, the founding texts which were giving us the theoretical frameworks and the practices to go by it. They did not engage sufficiently with the category of memory. You look at Said, you find that absence. You look at Griffiths, you find that absence. Spivak, So you find that there is a nominal way in which, and sometimes there's a subtle way in which, there is a subtextual way in which memory comes in as a very, very central theme, but there is no active engagement with the category of memory in the traditional postcolonial framework. So if you look at, because our canonical postcolonial vocabulary is also very Saidian in some sense, right? But Said, So Said's vocabulary stressed narratives and stories over remembrances. So if I could break this down into very crude, simple terms, at some level, when one is talking about an event like partition, it looks like it's easier to engage with partition through memory because there are no documents. Yeah. So, but if there is a documented history, even if it could be a forgotten document, it could be a document which needs to be unearthed. Maybe it's something buried deep into those, in these archives. Yeah. So one need not rely on the tools of memory. Yeah. So I hope you're with me in this, in the sense that it becomes easier to deal with post-colonial narratives through these tools of archives, documents. It could be of any kind, It need not be the state archives. It need not be the officially documented archives, So sometimes it becomes comforting to deal with post-coloniality in those terms than through the different tools of memory. We will, of course, have some time to come back and unpack these terms further. But quite conversely, in this respective of this paradoxical relationship between post-colonial studies and memory studies, we do realize that the field of memory studies, quite conversely, had also stayed away from the narratives of colonialism or post-colonialism. If you look at, again, some of the earliest works on based on memory studies. So one of the things that came across as an easy fit was looking at trauma, Holocaust, memory studies and Holocaust is such an easy fit. And from our side of the world, as I mentioned, partition, it seems to be, a close fit, though there have not been too many, academic historical engagements in a very pronounced way. So this fundamental premise, which is paradoxical as well, it began to change. It has begun to change in the last a couple of decades, right? So it is in this context that I want to push this argument further and show how the narratives of post-coloniality, how the potential of these narratives to tell a different kind of a story begins to showcase itself when you enter this discourse through the lens of memory studies. So I also want to spend some time talking about the term narrative. So what is a narrative? So at the beginning of my talk, I mentioned how I would love to enter this. I would like to enter this discourse in this intersection between post-colonialism and postmodernism. So in that sense, when we are talking about narrative, which could be traditionally defined as a spoken or written account of connected events, it's a story, and in very simple terms, I would like to draw upon Roland Barthes' definition of narratives, which is very inclusive. Some of you may already be familiar with it. And it's also, Barthes also is located very centrally in this transition from structuralism towards post-structuralism. So there is some kind of a liminality and an inclusiveness about his approach towards narrative. So when I look at narrative, when here in this context, when we are talking about post-colonial narratives, we are also approaching it from a very Barthian point of view. So in Barthes' words, according to Barthes, the narratives of the world are numberless. There is no way in which you could limit narratives. So he also talks about how narratives could include, a narrative could include a prodigious variety of genres. And it could be articulated in language. It could be spoken or written. It could be fixed or moving images. It could be gestures. It could be even a mixture of everything. And according to him, narrative could be present in a myth, legend, fable, tale, a novella, an epic. It could be part of tragedy, comedy, all kinds of genres. It could be part of a mime, a painting. It can be found, he says, even in a stained glass window or in cinema, in photography, in comics, in a news item. It could be a random conversation. So narrative could be present anywhere. And he pushes this really further and says that the very history of mankind is about narrative. And this is what, as an aside, we also mentioned this narrative turn in historiography from the 1970s onwards. Some of you may be already familiar with it. Hayden White inaugurated this narrative turn to the extent of arguing that there is no history without narrative. So fundamentally, it is from such a perspective that I come in and engage with these diverse but related terms as well. So when Barthes concludes his these definitive descriptions about narrative, he says it is international, trans-historical, and trans-cultural, and it is simply there like life itself. So there is something, there's a liminal quality about this approach towards narrative, which I also find very handy now when we are looking at postcoloniality from our current location, where there is an increasing way in which identities, increasing a way in which our all kinds of definitions, theoretical frameworks, everything is increasingly fragmented. But at the same time, there is a way in which this fragmentation could be celebrated as well. So that is the one of the ways in which I would like to engage with this question. Yeah. So again, drawing your attention to how there could be different shifts in technology, culture, politics that could be influencing our understanding of memory. Let me give you one quick example, also in alignment with what talks about. Yeah? So there was a point when, if I could take you back in history of English language and literature, printing becomes very important. It's an iconic historical event which changes the way in which not just the dissemination of knowledge happens, but also the way in which you remember. Yeah. The way in which you document. Yeah. So that is that's why I find that there's no way in which we can disconnect these aspects of technology, culture, politics, because they are all very, very interlinked. Yeah. If you look at printing, you look at photography, it radically changes the way in which you document knowledge, you remember information, you reproduce information, you disseminate information. Yeah. And more importantly, as some of the neuroscientists would also argue that with these kind of shifts, with these sort of changes affecting the way we document, the way we look at narratives, the way the human brain is wired to remember, the way the human mind is wired to document and disseminate, that also changes. Yeah, because you can if you could think about life before smartphones and after smartphones, and the way in which we document things, and especially in the last few months, almost a year now, yeah, after COVID, it's a very different way in which we engage with spaces as well. Yeah, so the very different way in which the spatial reorganization has affected the way in which we remember, we document, we disseminate knowledge, even in the way we present ourselves. Yeah, vocabulary changes. So I want you to be able to see this continuum and this dialogue connection between these otherwise different aspects. It could be technology, it could be culture, it could be politics. We find that when you talk about narrative, when you talk about memory, when you talk about historiography, these are all connected aspects. Yeah. So yes. Before we move on, I to further accentuate the context of what we are talking about over here, let me draw your attention to a work by Margaret Atwood. So there is her work In Search of Alias Grace. Yeah, she sort of tells us about a certain event, which I will very quickly read to you an excerpt from it. So when I lived, and this is from Margaret Atwood, In Search of Alias Grace. When I lived in the rural Ontario countryside north of Toronto, a local man said, "There is the barn where we hid the women and children. That time the Fenians invaded. An individual barn, individual women and children. The man who told me about the barn was born some 60 years after the Fenian attack. But he said we, not they. He was remembering a personal experience, an event at which he had not been present in the flesh. And I believe we all have done that. It is at such points that memory, history, and story all intersect." Yeah, let's just repeat the last bit. He was remembering a personal experience, an event at which he had not been present in the flesh. And I believe we all have done that. It is at such points that memory, history, and story all intersect. Yeah? Let me also, as a corollary, remind you of another work which would be closer to home as well, Midnight's Children. Yeah? Salman Rushdie, the work that inaugurated many post-colonial moments and many postmodern moments in Indian English literature, and also had positioned Indian English literature in a different way in the world map. Yeah? So when, of course, it was a huge success in terms of academic reception, critical reception, and the way in which, it opened up a huge market for a whole lot of things. Yeah. So after the success of Midnight Children, there is a very small essay that Rushdie wrote, Errata or Unreliable Narration in Midnight Children. So there he first talks about the many errors which are part of Midnight Children, sometimes consciously and sometimes inadvertently. Yeah, there are a lot of conscious errors, very deliberate errors. He says, he did that so that he could keep the reader engaged, keeping the reader in the game, so that the reader will get a kick out of pointing out the errors that this famous author made. Yeah, so we do know that there is some kind of an eccentricity which is part and parcel of Rushdie's writings and discourse as well. Yeah, so that aside, and he talks about how these errors were built into the text. Yeah, also because that was the way in which Salim Sinai, the protagonist, chose to remember it. Yeah? So at some level, in this entire discourse about the nation, this entire discourse about generating an alternative historiography, he attributes a whole lot of credit to the way in which Salim Sinai chooses to remember. Yeah? And I use this phrase, choosing to remember, very advisedly. Yeah? Again, drawing from the same essay, Rat or Unreliable Narration, Rushdie recalls an instance where he remembers the trauma and the paranoia that he experienced during the time of the 1960s Indo-China War. Yeah? So he writes one whole paragraph about the paranoia that he experienced during that time, about, they were all scared of whether the Chinese army was advancing or not. Then he suddenly remembers, I was not in India when this was happening. Yeah? He was in Britain. So where does this memory come from? But he again says, this is how I choose to remember that experience. It is not about whether he was there in person or not. It is not about whether he experienced it in flesh or not. Yeah? What becomes more important is how this narrative is entirely framed by how he chooses to remember it, how his mind, his body, his brain, his memory, everything is dictated by so many other things that his actual physical presence becomes something secondary altogether. And like Atwood says, we all do that at various points of time. Yeah, because sometimes you talk about certain experiences, certain events which are far removed from history by again using this pronoun we. Yeah, we fought against the Britain. Yeah, you and I did not fight. Yeah, we don't even know anyone who was actually, there in the war front when this whole thing that we now identify as the independence struggle was happening. But still, it is this collective memory that is at work. It is this public memory that is at work, which legitimately allows us to use this pronoun in an unproblematic way. We. Yeah, but again, if you think about it very, very carefully, very incisively, who is this we that we are identifying with? Yeah, when we say we fought the British, we were fighting against whoever enemy the enemy country is. We were invaded. Who is this we that we are identifying ourselves with? So towards the end of this session, when I will very briefly talk about the Anglo-Indian community, it is also some of it was a part of the ongoing work from our center. I will also draw attention again. So just bookmark this point in your mind now about how we identify. We think we are identifying with a set of people whom we all know. There is a collective homogeneous sort of a body when we say, we fought the British or we did this, when we were not present physically, emotionally, or we were not even there at that point of time. So this the dichotomy, the way in which we identify ourselves with particular kinds of identities, communities, ideologies, it is very interesting, and it is very much governed by the aspects of the remembrances, the way we choose to remember. The way we choose to remember fundamentally dictates the way we choose to identify as well. So I will quickly move to another premise. Yeah, these are, I'm not giving any. This is, I would like to believe that, we are trying to deliberate this point together. There are no conclusive ways in which you can say this is this way or that way, but I hope, this will open up a lot of engaging thoughts for you from other multiple perspectives as well. Yeah? So at some level, what I'm also trying to push forward is this argument that memory studies, when you're using memory as a tool, it has the power and the potential to change history's monopoly over past. Yeah, this is there's some way in which we find that the boundaries between memory and history, it's always blurred, as you know, because it has always been the case, but now with more theoretical frameworks in place, with more tools, more academic and theoretical tools in place to engage with this, it's becoming more and more prominent that the boundary between history and memory are very thin and sometimes almost non-existent. And memory studies as a domain, it enables us to challenge history's monopoly over past. So what are the tools that memory could use? So I am a student of literature, and I do believe that fiction is something which is very, very powerful to engage with history and memory at the same time. Yeah? Because what does fiction do? Fiction offers us this new kind of possibility. Fiction offers us this platform through which you can tell a story about what could have happened. Yeah? Again, I'm taking you back to Rushdie and his Midnight Children. Yeah? So what Midnight Children does is, it is not giving the story of a fictional nation. Yeah? It is giving an alternate history. And how is that achieved in that text? By giving us different possibilities. Yeah, I'll give you a couple of very quick examples so that that those sort of instances from the text will act as some kind of hook for us to carry on with this deliberation. So one example, a quick example about the entire plot structure, about the entire way in which this narrative is framed is that he chooses to start at a point which is neither colonial nor nationalist. He chooses to start at a point which is neither India nor any of the countries that were formed after the different partitions. It's neither India nor Bangladesh nor Pakistan. Yeah, so he starts in the 1920s, 1930s. Yeah, during the period of the early colonial modernity. So I'm giving, we'll not get into the details of the text as such. Yeah. So I have found something very interesting, that if you look at the starting point of post-colonial narratives, yeah, there is a way in which we find that modernity, colonial modernity, at many levels could act as a fine starting point, which can lead into different histories. If you take Salim Sinai, when he's remembering his history, he chooses to begin with the 1920, not 1947, the year on which he was born. Yeah. So Salim Sinai, the protagonist, he's born in 1947 at that midnight moment, which is what the novel is entirely about. But his memory of his history, the memory of his life, the story of his life begins from the 1920s. Yeah. And that is not a time which is accessible to him in any form. Yeah. So it is about not just about his own memory. It is about these many, many remembered versions that he's been surrounded with. Yeah? And we know that, at a very fundamental level, at a very crude, simplistic level, we all tend to do that. Yeah, which is why I do find, this domain of this field of memory studies very interesting, because there is an intersection of the mundane and this, very profound theoretical, philosophical frameworks. We tend to do that too, even with events that we are not part of, experiences that we are not part of, we tend to remember it in such a way that they also become very, very fundamental to the ways in which we define our identity. Yeah? So that is what happens with this fictional character, Salim Sinai, and we do know how these starting points, the starting point from 1920, that's the time of the colonial modernity, and how that sort of helped him as well as his family to situate their identity and their fraught and fragmented identities within this nation. He does not we will find that, if you've engaged with Midnight Children, you will find, of course, the text also has a lot of limitations in the kind of alternate history that it tries to provide. The storytelling also has a lot of, it's deeply problematic at so many levels when you engage it from different aspects of postcoloniality. There are aspects of gender that could be troubling. There are aspects of, caste, class, region, which could be troubling. Yeah. So that aside, yeah, it offers as a fresh perspective, offers as a fresh framework to tell a story about the nation, which does not necessarily start with the midnight moment, which does not necessarily start with an anti-colonial moment. It starts with something, or something that I this term I find very handy, colonial modernity. It starts with colonial modernity. It's about a man, he talks about his grandfather who denounces his faith, yeah, and there is this, the secular modern individual emerging, yeah, and the story at some level is also about that, right? So here, there is something which, again, repeating a couple of things that I mentioned before, it is all about how Salim Sinai chooses to remember. It's all about what an author like Salman Rushdie enables his character, Salim Sinai, to remember. Yeah? So at this context, there's another word that the post-colonial narratives have immensely engaged with. At the beginning of this talk, I stated how there's a paradoxical relationship with memory from all the canonical texts from Said till Spivak. Yeah? There's not been an active engagement with the element of memory, though it comes in, in very subtle ways. But there's another a word that post-colonial narratives have very centrally engaged with: forgetting. Yeah, it's almost like engaging with the twin. Yeah, they're not really always like forgetting is not the opposite of remembering as such. It is actually part and parcel of it. Yeah, if you actually think about it. Yeah, so which is why Amy is saying, yeah, the Afro-Caribbean writer, he refers to the empire as the forgetting machine. Yeah, so if we take that aspect of forgetting and infuse it into the post-colonial narratives that we are familiar with, we find that there is a politics of forgetting and there is a politics of memory which is at work, and that has always been determining the kind of historiography that gets written, the kind of stories that get written. Yeah, because this act of forgetting, it's very powerful. Yeah, because sometimes the state directs things in such a way that you would forget. Yeah, the absence of memorial. Yeah. The event of emergency. Emma Tallow has this very interesting book called Unsettling Memories, where she talks about how for an event like emergency, there is no memorial in place. Yeah, for an event like emergency, there is no state memorial in place. So there is an act of forgetting which is encouraged in a very systematic, institutional way. The presence or absence of certain historical artifacts, yeah, the naming of streets, yeah, all of these could have a lot of impact in the way we remember, in the way we forget, yeah, which is why, when you talk about nation formation, when you talk about writing history, yeah, this is something very central to the different processes through which nations' identities are formed, because one needs to be very conscious of what one chooses to remember and what gets documented. So there is, the act of forgetting. There is something very deliberate about this act of forgetting as well, because we might tend to think in very mundane, very casual terms that, when you forget something, it is something which happens inadvertently. Yeah, but there is a lot of training. There is a lot of deliberateness that goes into this act of forgetting as well. But because only when you forget the right kind of things, the things that you want to remember, the things that you choose to remember, systemically sometimes, institutionally sometimes, will get foregrounded as well. And this is, this politics is as part of almost all kinds of historiographies, all kinds of history telling in different parts of the world. Yeah. So when I'm trying to connect these seemingly disconnected but related points with the central aspect of your webinar, when you're talking about freedom struggles, yeah, it is again important to ask in what forms these struggles have been documented, and again, who struggles. Yeah, the entire narrative of freedom struggle, the ways in which freedom struggles have been documented or remembered, yeah, we will find that it all takes different colors, they all take different shapes when approached from different locations, from the location of gender, from the location of region, yeah, because region also plays a huge role. Like depending on geographically where you were, where one was positioned during these sort of struggles of different kinds, depending on your actual physical geographical location, your experience of the event also changes, yeah, and your gendered location, your casted location, yeah. Your religious location, everything plays a huge role in determining your share of this experience, yeah, and your share of trauma, your share of the privileges of it, yeah, everything changes accordingly, yeah, and much has been written about this from different perspectives, from subaltern studies being one of the prominent examples, yeah, but more than everything, I too believe that when you approach everything through this the lens of fiction, yeah, enabled by the theoretical frameworks of memory, yeah, it opens up to us a very different world altogether. Yeah. Sometimes, if I could, give you another, example from some of the work that we had been doing. Again, I'm referring to the Jallianwala Bagh event and the way in which we chose to look at it through the lens of technology as well, in addition to the other available frameworks. What that also did was to sort of give a more nuanced understanding, a more experiential understanding, an immersive understanding of a reality which could otherwise be approached only through these different ideological frameworks or different historical frameworks, which are also biased in different way. Yeah, it's in that sense that at some level technology also comes in as a level. When you talk about archives, when you talk about the internet being an archive, unlike the state archive or unlike the other forms of archives which are mediated by these many state or other agentic machineries, you find that there's a certain kind of liberation which is at work, which is available when it is mediated by technology. And that's something that we will not get into at the moment, and it's a bit beyond the scope of the talk as well. So what I'm trying to largely convey is that when one is looking at postcolonial narratives, the different possibilities of narrating postcoloniality, one also needs to be very attentive and very aware of these newer historiographies and the alternate stories which are enabled by the forms, frameworks, and lenses which were otherwise not perhaps available to us. Yeah, and I will end with this by accentuating, by foregrounding the power of storytelling. Yeah, because as I mentioned, I have in all these researches and in all my approaches, I find that it pays a lot if you invest heavily in this form of fiction, because fiction is this space which offers endless possibilities, and which is why if you notice, it is fiction which gets banned, not history books, not biology books. Yeah, people are more keen to ban. State governments are keener to ban fiction writers. Yeah, Rushdie is the one who's not given permission to attend certain events, and Pamuk, who was invoked at the beginning of the session. Yeah, he also faces problems, not because he's a historian, yeah, because he's a fiction writer. So that's a kind of power that fiction is invested with. Yeah, so stories do have this power to connect the cognitive and the narrative, and that's also something I find. That's something that we have the students of memory studies, scholars of memory studies, have found this connection between the cognitive and the narrative. Yeah, through the lens of memory, it sort of presents itself in the most malleable form and the most succinct form in fiction, right? And it also gives us a kind of a discourse network through which you can approach history, you can approach events from a very different perspective altogether. So I'll wrap up by drawing attention to one more work along with Rushdie's Midnight Children, which is Alan Seeley's Trottonama. So Alan Seeley's Trottonama also has this huge canvas, yeah, through which it looks at the story of the nation. But the only difference is that, and a very, very crucial difference is that it looks at the history of Anglo-Indians, yeah, the Anglo-Indian community over 7 generations. So when you're talking about Midnight Children, there is an understanding that, there's a colonial, post-colonial binary within which you can locate the story. Salim Sinai is someone who's caught in this in-between space. His identity, which is religious and secular at the same time, and also he was mixed, he was switched at birth with another child, as you might be familiar if you're familiar with the plot. Yeah, so all of these complications add to the nuanced nature of his identity, but fundamentally the framework of post-coloniality over there, and in most narratives that we are familiar with, it's between this binary of coloniality and post-coloniality. There's an empire, which is, the machine of forgetting, as Amy would say. There's an empire, and also there are these different colonies, including, our own country, right? So it is this post-colonial framework, in this binary, with this binary of coloniality and post-coloniality, that we have been trained to look at, largely been trained to look at post-colonial experiences and post-colonial narratives. When you look at Alan Seeley's Trottenama, you suddenly have a different framework altogether. The historical canvas is entirely different. So it's a story about the Anglo-Indian community. When you look at the Anglo-Indian community, where do you trace the beginning? From the earliest colonial intervention. Yeah? It is not British colonialism. Yeah? From the earliest colonial intervention, without this binary of the colonizer, without this binary of coloniality and post-coloniality. It is more nuanced because they are a community of mixed race. Yeah, they're a community of which was born out of miscegenation. Yeah, there is a discourse. There is something about the origin which challenges the discourse of legitimacy, which narratives of coloniality and narratives of post-coloniality want to hold on to. Yeah, the origin, their trajectory, their stories, their lives, everything radically challenges all kinds of discourses of legitimacy, which is inherent in narratives of post-coloniality. Yeah? And it becomes difficult, we do not know from what which could be the entry point, which would facilitate a discussion, through which we can take a discussion on Trottenama ahead. Yeah, because Midnight Children is a text which can be comfortably read within post-colonial frameworks. You look at Trottenama, it's the Anglo-Indian community whose origins are, from the earliest colonial invaders from the Portuguese times onwards. Yeah, the Portuguese, Dutch, French, and then the British, right? And the constitutional definition. It is constitutionally defined as a minority community, right? So there is and also this their post-colonial experience is very different from any other post-colonial community. Yeah, if this freedom struggle that one is talking about, if that was a liberating experience, by and large, for the post-colonial community, it was also an experience which left the Anglo-Indian community fairly orphaned, because then they suddenly realized they belong neither there nor here, and there's no way in which they felt betrayed when the British left. It's difficult to sort of gauge their sense of loyalty because their idea of home was also very different. Of course, the nation in which, the soil in which they were born was home to them at some level, but there was also a home which they had never seen, depending on who their ancestor was. Yeah, so it's a very complicated history. One is here not necessarily trying to draw a hierarchy of post-colonial narratives, but my intention is to draw attention to the fact that there are a number of communities, a number of alternate narratives, from which when you enter the story of post-colonialism, you find that this framework will not work anymore. Yeah? These stories will not work anymore. It's not the Saidian model. You cannot use the Saidian model or the Spivak model to understand a work written from the perspective of the Anglo-Indian community. Yeah, Alan Seeley's Trottenama, which is one of the most underworked, under-researched texts, I would say it's a perfect example. Yeah, the other post-colonial frameworks, there are a number of post-colonial frameworks available to us. They will not work when you're trying to dissect a text like this, because the post-colonial framework that we are used to, that we are most comfortable in, using as a framework, as a tool, yeah, it is largely located in this binary of coloniality and post-coloniality. Maybe, there are ways in which a certain degrees would keep changing here and there depending on caste, gender, region, yeah, all these locations. But irrespective of these, the ways in which you accommodate these degrees of difference, you find that it is not inclusive enough to accept, perhaps to accommodate everything. Yeah. So, yes, if you would like to, discuss more about this or know about this, certainly feel free to write to me. So again, I will wrap up with this. And thank you for listening. I hope, this also gave you a few directions to take forward, or also, I really hope that, this also opened up some kind of a dialogue for in your own mind with the kind of discourses that you are familiar with the kind of research frameworks that you are familiar with, and with what you would like to take it forward. Yeah. Thank you very much for your time. And again, thank you for your kind invitation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We'll be taking questions now. The platform is now open for questions for discussion. You could type your questions in the chat box here in the Google Meet, or you could alternatively, if you've joined through YouTube, you could type your questions there and we'll be taking it up from there. In the meantime, thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful presentation. Ma'am spoke about how post-coloniality is, could be looked at through the lens of memory studies, and how there was this paradigm shift, like when we talk about the paradigm shift of postmodernism and all those things, but now we look at from what we know to how we know. And I find, like these kind of questions when we address to certain historians. I was at this particular seminar once where we had renowned historians, and when we talked about postmodernism, they were kind of reluctant to answer, like, how can we talk about legitimate narratives of the past? How can we, give recognize certain of these as legitimate ones and the others? How do we exclude some and how we include some? So all that you have just spoken about, and you spoke about how there is certainly a politics at work of how history comes to us. Depending on from where it comes and from who it comes. And you talked about this printing to be the point, like where you have before and after, and all those things where you underline that memory is defining how we see things. And of course, the we that we talk about here, we talk of in this generation when we sit here and we talk about the post-colonial times, the we, that collective we which we use, we do that, factoring in all the versions of memory which we have been handed down from the generations before us. And we take that to be part of our identity. And you did, trump memory, history, how memory trumps history and its monopoly over the past. And that, I think, will bring out how we have the upper hand here as part of story and literature fiction. You spoke of how stories have this power to connect to the cognitive and narrative through memory. And I think you rounded off with that very important point by bringing in the Anglo-Indian community. That itself, it places in perspective post-coloniality, where we think of post-coloniality, the larger academic community here, especially, I would like to say that it was interesting to hear of that particular perspective. You think about post-coloniality from various perspectives, but we did not think about how it would be for the people in between who do not know, like, which angle to, pursue post-colonial accounts or narratives, or like the accounts of freedom, like it would be the same for us and for them. So that's just a beginning, I'm sure. We know that there must be more of such aberrations which need to be addressed, and of course, which you very importantly are planning to do as part of your Center for Memory Studies. Thank you, ma'am, for such a wonderful session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leela. Yeah, they really beautifully summed up this, I think in more coherent ways than I did. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. So we'll take some questions now. Basima, are there?
Yeah. Najla, ma'am, we have some questions. I forwarded those questions to you, ma'am. Please have a look.
Could you just read that out, Mridul, if you have?
Yeah, okay, ma'am. So, Deepthi Mohan is asking, can you suggest some theoretical works or books on memory studies to get a comprehensive view about the same?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Deepthi. I'm glad that you asked this. I can immediately suggest a couple of works. One, in fact, Dr. Najila also had mentioned when at the beginning of the session, there is this reader which is edited by Jeffrey Olick, yeah, which I think is a fine starting point. There are also a couple of, I can just put them in the chat box. Yeah. Astrodor is a writer that is a theorist that you can look up. Yeah. So yeah, and I would be happy to provide whatever support that I could if you write to me. I do have some access to some ebooks which I will be very happy to share with you. And if you're interested in looking at memory from a historical point of view, you can start with again. So here Nora, he's a French historian who first started talking about the connection between memory and history. Right? And Astrid Earl, Jeffrey Olick, yeah, Osman, yeah, they are some of the leading theorists of these times. And at this point, I'm also happy to let you know that we are collaborating at the moment with most of these people. Astrid Earl is part of the Frankfurt Memory Studies platform. We could, do a joint event with their center, yeah, earlier this last year, right? So if you could get in touch with our center, we will be happy to help you with material, with resources. We also have, there's a website that I can perhaps later I can share this with Dr. Najila and Basima, and if students who are interested can get in touch with them and get details from that. So being, since there aren't too many resources available from this part of the world, we're really happy to function as a nodal point if you are keen in continuing any kind of research from this perspective. Yeah. So I will be happy to help, and I can leave my email ID here. You can write to me directly as well. Yeah. Yes, and I see another question here. Can we look at canonical texts of colonial experience in the angle of memory studies? Like the ones of Chile, of course. Yeah? When you're looking at canonical texts, that is something very important as students of literature, looking at canon, looking at historiography from a critical standpoint from different perspectives. It is something very fundamental, very important that we should be doing. So when you look at this from the angle of memory studies, and yes, like all the other kinds of critical examinings of canon, critical examinings of historiography, we would know that these biases are also not just historiographical. The biases are not just always systemic. There's a politics of remembering and forgetting, as well, as you said. Yeah. So if you're thinking about if you think about the colonial the writings on colonial experience, yeah, and we do have different forms in which these writings have been articulated as memoirs, as different forms of narratives. It could be anthropological, it could be biographical, yeah. So experience mediated by memory plays a huge role in that, yeah. So here again, I'm because I find this approaching these questions from the angle of say Anglo-Indian studies also very, very informative, because it gives us a perspective which is not otherwise available to us. Yeah, like when we are talking about, say, post-coloniality, and if we are bringing in a writer like Rushdie or Achibi, yeah, we do know that there are certain at the risk of not finding any other word, let me say there's a certain predictability associated with these sort of narrative. There's a certain kind of convenience that you would find when you're engaging with these work. But when you try and look at this from the perspective of memory studies, of trying to locate for voices whose memories, there's no way for those memories to be recorded. Yeah, there's not even a representative figure. Yeah, because again, I'm using the example of the Anglo-Indian community because that's also a very convenient example. I feel there's no representative figure because they could be descendants from British colonialism. It could be Portuguese. Yeah, because there's a huge sea of difference between these, depending on from where you descended, because the skin color differs. That's a different politics altogether. Yeah, the way in which you are, your identity is described. It depends also on your skin color, also on the accent that you would pick up. Yeah, and if you are interested in this, I'll be happy to continue this conversation with you, and depending on whether English is your mother tongue or not, because there are these Anglo-Indians of Portuguese descent, some of whom are located in different parts of Kerala, for whom English is not a mother tongue, and they are not part of the Anglo-Indian Association, because there's even Anglo-Indians like Alan Seeley, they strongly believe that if you do not speak the language, then you're not Anglo-Indian. But then how about the Anglo-Indians who descended from non-English speaking countries like Portuguese or French, and again the Constitution has recognized only the descendants who are from the from the paternal line, it should be from the father's side, so if it is from the mother's side, there's no recognition constitutionally. You're not an Anglo-Indian, so how do when you talk about mixed race community, because in this part of the country, in our academic circles, in our academic discourses, we are not really trained to talk about race, gender, religion and caste. There is some kind of because those are also our immediate realities, but it would be unfair to think that, given that there are a lot of mixed race communities, not just Anglo-Indian communities, there are also the Jewish communities. Because Kerala also has there are certain pockets where there are Jewish communities who have miscegenated, intermarried. So it would be unfair not to start talking about mixed race communities too when we are talking about post-coloniality. And of course, sorry, Anju, I deviated quite a bit from your question. Of course, when we are talking about canonical texts and when we dissect it, when we incisively critique them from the angle of memory studies, of course, again, you find that, the consensus, which is otherwise available there, to begin to splinter in very telling ways, right? Yes, I hope this answers your question, Anju.
Thank you, ma'am. I think there's another question. Meher J. Bushra would like to know, could you suggest some books, some authors dealing with memory studies and its connection with postmodernism? I know Atwood, Rushdie, and Barnes, Julian Barnes.
Okay. So Atwood, Rushdie, and Barnes are fiction writers. So if, of course, so let me think of, the best way to answer this too. I do understand, Bushra, where you come from in terms of, when you say authors dealing with memory studies. I think, fundamentally all narratives are also about memory, because it's just that, in some texts, it's easier for us to nitpick the memory element because we also work with limited tools, Sometimes it's like saying, say, Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable dealt with caste and the other works did not, or, to say, okay, Rushdie is talking about the fragmented identity of the Muslim community, and the others did not, because these things are there everywhere. It would be, I would say, not wrong, but I think, it's a very delimited way in which we engage with texts. If you would say that there are certain texts which deal with memory and certain texts that do not, just the way I do think, as a student of literature, maybe the kind of training that we should aim to get and the kind of reading that we should be able to do is to get into the text and to see it even when it is not blatantly visible to us. So Rushdie's is a very evidently postmodern text, but we do know that there are a lot of works before that which could be read in a postmodern way as well. So yeah, I'm not very, I do understand, Bushra, where this question comes from, but I'm not very entirely comfortable in classifying just a set of authors as, dealing with this and a set of authors dealing with that. Because memory studies, I believe, gives us the tool to get into any text and to see how memory operates as a central determining thing, kind of determining the trajectory of not just the plot, but also the entire historiography itself. But of course, Rushdie, Atwood, Barnes, in that line, if I am to, think of a few more writers, Pamuk, of course, and Ghosh, and most post-colonial writers, I would say, they do engage with memory in very central terms. And in that sense, postmodernism is also a celebration of individual memory at some level. It talks about, the way I remember the event becomes more important than what actually happened, and also this larger truth of, there's nothing like what actually happened. It really, because, and again, it's not entirely a postmodern thing, because Rashomon effect, you must be familiar with the movie Rashomon. Yeah, the single event is being looked at from, narrated by 7 different people who were all witnesses. Yeah, but there are 7 different stories that emerge. Yeah, so yes, the challenge is perhaps to engage with maybe any text and see how memory works as an entry point to give an alternate historiography, right? Yes. Yeah.
Hello, ma'am. We have yet another question. May I read it out?
Yes, please.
Thank you. So this is from one of our faculty. She'd like to know, could you please explain the Babri Masjid incident and that of Ram Raj in this aspect of memory studies?
Okay. If you don't mind, can you just elaborate that question? In what sense? In a fictional representation, or
I'm not quite sure. That was a very short one. She's just mentioned how we can look at the memory study. We can look at the events of Babri Masjid incident and the idea of Ram Raj from a memory studies aspect. That's pretty much all I have.
Yeah. So if you look at this event, and of course, it's very deeply political. It is deeply religious. It is deeply historical. It is, of course, we don't have to get into the details of it. Yeah, but I think it's also one fine example where you will find that history and memory. Yeah, there's this constant tussle. Yeah, because if one is able to answer once and for all the question, what is history in this, and what is myth or story, or what is memory in it? I think we don't have a problem anymore. But we do know that like most things, it is not that simple. If you could take any historical event of similar kinds, of different kinds, you take Holocaust for instance. So what is the crux of the problem over there? There is a certain kind of a history. There is also a certain kinds of myth / memory / experience which governs political decisions. So in the same way, if we take the case of the Babri Masjid and the Ram Rajya discourse too, there is this binary which exists between history and myth / memory / experience. But at the same time, at some level, one cannot really distinguish, or one chooses not to distinguish one from the other. So which is why, when one talks about the politics of memory, when one talks about the politics of history, we do realize that when it comes, theoretically, it's very easy to define. Theoretically, it's very easy to talk about, what history is, what memory is, what experience is. But when it comes to a lot of real events, we find that it's all mixed up. And it is a very, very real problem too, which is why I feel, whether we are talking about an event like Jallianwala Bagh, or an event like Holocaust or emergency or partition, it is important to bring in memory as a real tool as well, bring in memory as a solid framework as well, in order to contest these many different, otherwise legitimate things such as history or religion / myth / experience. So yes, memory studies, I would say, would offer a tool, a framework to look at this particular instance as well, like it does to most historical events. Because memory is about people, and events, history, that's also about people. There is, just like Hayden White or Pierre Nora would say, there is no history without narrative. There is no history without memory either. So these are all, the beauty is in trying to understand this connection, and also how problematic it is. It's the complexity of it and the inconvenience of it, which makes it all the more challenging as well.
I'd like to just add, ma'am, In relation to this question, I had encountered a writer called Bolwar Mohammed Kunni from Kannada. He's a Kannada writer, and he had written actually about a story where you have a Muslim woman, an old woman. She's actually putting away money and keeping it with another Hindu neighbor. And the relationship between them and what they find in the end, towards the end of the story, is that the son of this Hindu neighbor has gone on to be part of this Babri Masjid demolition plan. And when he comes back, she says that when you come back, bring me a brick from Babri Masjid. And she just puts it in her house, so as a memory of this particular incident. And you have it, it's a very simple story. It's of course a story, not a theoretical work, or like it's not the analysis that I've read. So it is actually giving you an alternative account of the people involved, like, the micro, the nuances of all this event, which you find as an this event that you see in the news, or maybe you read in the newspapers, but how it is that people take in these events and how it affects them. So I think literary representations of all these do give us additional perspectives. I don't know how memory would work there, but of course it does give us additional perspectives. And
yes, of course. Thank you so much for sharing this. So what's the name of this work?
I don't remember the name. It's a short story actually, but the work is by Bolwar Mohammed Kunni.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's very useful to know. Yeah, thank you.
Writer, I think he's been translated into English.
Yes.
Ma'am, I think we'll just take one more question if you are comfortable with that, and then we
can take one more and wrap up. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. There's a question from Gayatri Verma. She asks, how do you negotiate the notion of space, geographical, cultural, and so on, created in fiction through the lens of memory?
Yes, yeah. It's a very excellent question. Thank you, Gayatri, for asking this. Yeah. Space becomes, a very interesting phenomenon when you look at it within the space of any fiction, and from the lens of memory studies, it would even becomes even more interesting. Again, if I could give you a couple of quick examples that I can think of. Amitav Ghosh's Shadow Lines, yeah, where space becomes something which is geographical in a different way. Yeah? It's not just about the physical space. The atlas, if you're familiar with the novel, you would know that, the atlas, the map becomes a very important category over there. Yeah? So there is this protagonist, the narrator, who remains unnamed. Yeah? When he is looking at the atlas, he is also entering into a world which was experienced by another person. Yeah. So, and this of course, make more sense to you if you're familiar with the text. Yeah. So here, space becomes not just the physical space; it's also about the many experienced memory, and also the kind of memory which is not part of your experience, but someone told it to you. It's part of somebody else's experience, which was narrated to you, and it becomes your own as well. To such an extent that this unnamed narrator in Shadow Lines, when he's in Calcutta, when he is first introduced to London, yeah, when he's first introduced to the city through an atlas, and later through the many experiences of people who had been there. His cousin visits, but he's clueless. He's never traveled anywhere outside his hometown. But as a grown-up, as an adult, when he eventually goes to this city, which he had never experienced, that time he feels that it's like a deja vu for him. He recognizes more things. He recognizes streets and anecdotes and artifacts much more than, in certain cases, the people who grew up over there. Yeah? So space takes a very interesting dimension, and from the point of view of memory studies, there has been a lot of work done about spatiality and memory as well. And again, another example from the Anglo-Indian narratives. The idea of home, the idea of home as a space is conceived in a very nuanced way in Anglo-Indian narratives, because home is not just the space into which you were born, you were raised. Home is also this nostalgic space. Home is also this space that you've never seen, you've never experienced. Yeah. So there are there are a number of Anglo-Indians who migrated from India to different parts of Europe. Yeah. in search of a homeland. Yeah, and that home is not necessarily the place where their ancestors lived. Yeah, sometimes, it is also this extended sense of space, yeah, because any Western country could offer the similar kinds of experiences, and that hope and that nostalgia. Nostalgia is a very, very cardinal phenomenon in memory studies, where they look at it. I too find the studies of nostalgia very fascinating, and it gives a very different approach, different way in which we can engage with space as well. Yeah, because it is real and unreal at the same time. Yeah, and of course, to answer your question more pointedly, yes, when you look at space as geographical, cultural, as nostalgic. Yeah. So fiction, of course, as I said before, I do believe that fiction has the potential to stage these different things which are otherwise available to us only perhaps as a theory, only perhaps as a framework, and looked at through the lens of memory studies. Or I would say, space is such an interesting notion that when you look at it through any form, it's very interesting. And in post-colonial studies, true spatiality is very, very central. In postmodern studies, space is very central. And I feel that, I do believe that we have, there's another paradigm shift that has happened in terms of space in the last 1 year with COVID striking us. Yeah, because before that, if you're familiar with, I'll just close with one quick example. If you're familiar with Borges' Garden of Walking Paths, where he fictionally explores this idea of a person inhabiting two worlds, two realities at the same time. Yeah, I feel that the post-COVID and with these virtual meetings, at some level, we are also experiencing and negotiating with that. All of us at this moment are simultaneously inhabiting two spaces. One, our physical space, yeah, the space which is governed, which is determined by gravity, and the other is this virtual space. And we can do different things too in these two different spaces. So fiction, in fact, and I'm not just looking at that through the lens of memory studies alone. Fiction has this potential to show us the different possibilities of negotiating with the notion of space. Yeah, and that becomes more and more interesting, I would believe, in these increasingly digitized times, and looking at it through the lens of memory I would believe, accentuate it even further. And I personally also believe that, in the times to come, in the post-COVID times, maybe, the time will come, where there will be like post-colonialism and postmodernism. This will be another transnational term that we would be using, the post-COVID times. When you understand memory, when you understand space, everything is there's going to be a paradigm shift for sure, because our vocabulary has changed drastically. Our notion of space, our notion of knowledge, our notion of, seeing each other, hearing each other, getting in a room, getting out of a room, yeah, attendance, yeah, everything has changed radically, yeah. So I do think that, there are interesting times ahead for us to look at these different spaces and these different paradigms through perhaps different kinds of fiction too. Yeah, not just the kinds that we are used to. Maybe that is a fiction as a genre is also going to undergo a radical change in the post-COVID times, looking at various things. Yeah. So on that note, thank you all again very much for your very, very patient hearing, and also for your time. Yeah, and thank you for the interaction as well. Yeah, congratulations to the organizers again, and all the best for the remaining days as well. This has been a wonderful effort, yeah, and I'm sure it will be really noticed nationwide. I'm very glad to be a part of this. Thank you very much.
Ma'am, the pleasure is ours. You have actually opened up so many threads of inquiry, like the participants can, just take off from here with like maybe on the theoretical side, or maybe looking at investigations on the archival material, or maybe historical experiences that are accounted firsthand or witnessed, that have been witnessed, or even literary representations of these events. So you have given us a lot of points from where to take off from now, and all the participants also would appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Very kind of you to say that. Thank you very much.
To move on to the official vote of thanks, I would like to invite Jitin, right, to propose the official vote.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Marin, for those insightful informations. But unfortunately, due to the time constraint, we have to move to the end of the session. So now I would like to invite Jiten Kumar P, Assistant Professor, to deliver the vote of thanks. Sir, over to you.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. I'm here to do one of the most difficult tasks to extend gratitude. Even though we are fully aware of the limitations of language in composing feelings and emotions. So, firstly, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Dr. Marin Raj for delivering such a scholarly presentation. Memory studies is a really interesting perspective to look at narratives of freedom struggle. Thank you, ma'am, for such an insightful presentation. And I would like to express my gratitude to our dear HOD, Dr. Najla TY, for chairing the session and being her excellent self as usual. Next, I would like to put forward my thankful gesture to all those participants out there for being a part of this intellectual gathering. Last but not the least, I would like to thank all those who are staying behind the curtain, my colleagues and the organizers of this webinar, especially Basima, Mridul and Shail sir. Thank you all.
With that, we wind up our second session, plenary session of two-day national webinar on narratives of freedom struggle in South Asian literatures. We shall meet on 19th of this month, which is day after tomorrow, with our third keynote speaker, Dr. Asha S. from Central University, Kerala. Thank you all for being here. Please fill out the feedback form. Special thanks to Marin ma'am for gracing us with our presence virtually. This has been great, amazing for all of us to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you.